the Nigerian Civil War, or as many know it, the Biafran War, wasn't just a fight for secession. It was Africa's first great proxy war. Behind the headlines, the world's biggest powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, France and the US, weren't just watching. They were pulling strings, supplying weapons, choosing sides, counting profits. While millions of Africans starved, the superpowers turned Nigeria's pain into their political playground. This is the story of the Biafran War, when foreign powers played God in Africa. Nigeria gained independence from Britain in 1960, a new African giant stitched together from over 250 ethnic groups, 3 major regions, and centuries of colonial manipulation. The north was dominated by the Hausa Fulani, mostly Muslim and traditional. The west was Yoruba, proud, educated, politically savvy. And the east was Igbo, ambitious, entrepreneurial, and forward-looking. 3 regions, 3 ambitions. One ticking time bomb wrapped in a British flag, because Britain didn't leave behind unity. It left behind competition. You see, the British had ruled Nigeria with a clever trick called divide and rule. They gave power and prestige to the northern elites, knowing they'd keep the south in check. When independence came, London quietly backed northern dominance, because, well, a friendly government meant continued access to Nigeria's oil and markets. Even before the war began, Britain had picked its side, and it wasn't the side of equality. By the early 1960s, Nigeria looked like a success story, but underneath the ceremonies and smiling politicians, tribal rivalry and corruption were boiling. The first general elections were marred by fraud. Political violence erupted in the West. The military, mostly Igbo-led, began to lose faith in the politicians. And then came 1966, the year everything shattered. On January 15th, 1966, a group of young Nigerian army officers launched a coup. Their goal? End corruption. Save Nigeria. But most of the officers were Igbo. They killed the Prime Minister, Tafawa Balewa, and the Northern Premier, Ahmadu Bello, but spared the Eastern leader, Nnamdi Azikiwe. Even though the coup's leader, Major Ojukwu, claimed it wasn't ethnic, the optics were disastrous. To Northerners, it looked like an Igbo power grab, and in Nigeria, perception quickly becomes identity. 6 months later, Northern officers struck back. This time, it was bloody and personal. General Aguiyi Ironsi, an Igbo who led the country after the first coup, was murdered. Thousands of Igbo civilians in the north were massacred in retaliation. Families fleeing south told stories of trains filled with corpses. It was chaos, and Britain, Nigeria's former master, stayed silent. London's oil companies were still happy. Shell BP had just found huge deposits of crude in the Niger Delta, conveniently inside the eastern region, where the Igbos lived. Behind closed doors, British officials faced a choice: support the eastern region, home of their new oil fields, or the federal government, which promised one Nigeria and stability for business. In the end, they chose the latter. The logic was simple. A big united Nigeria under friendly leadership was easier to control than a new, uncertain Biafra that might nationalize oil or seek help elsewhere. And that decision would shape everything that followed. Down in the east, one man emerged as the voice of his people, Colonel Chukwuemeka Ojukwu. Educated at Oxford, charismatic and proud, he was the military governor of the eastern region. As the massacres of Igbos continued in the north, he demanded safety, autonomy, and justice. But Lagos, now led by General Yakubu Gowon, offered half-hearted promises. Ojukwu knew the writing was on the wall. He saw his people dying in their own country and realized the world wasn't going to save them, so he decided to do it himself. In January 1967, both sides met in Aburi, Ghana, to negotiate peace. Ojukwu wanted a loose federation, regional autonomy that would protect the East. Gowon agreed. at least while they were in Ghana. But when he returned to Lagos, Britain's advisors whispered in his ear, "Don't divide Nigeria. Keep it united. We'll support you." And suddenly, Gowon changed his mind. The Aburi Agreement was dead before the ink dried. It was now a countdown to war. On May 30th, 1967, Ojukwu stood before a cheering crowd in Enugu and declared, "The Republic of Biafra is born." The name came from the Bight of Biafra, the bay off Nigeria's coast. It symbolized rebirth, pride, and resistance, but for Britain it symbolized something else: risk. Because Biafra's new borders included almost all the oil-rich Niger Delta. London couldn't allow that. The Nigerian government declared war. Britain immediately supplied weapons, advisors, and intelligence to the federal side. The logic was simple: keep Nigeria united, keep the oil flowing. France, on the other hand, saw an opportunity. De Gaulle's France had just lost influence in Africa after the Algerian War. Supporting Biafra was a chance to poke Britain in the eye and gain access to oil under a new friendly regime. So France secretly backed Ojukwu, smuggling arms through Gabon and Ivory Coast. This was the 1960s, the height of the Cold War. Every conflict became a proxy battlefield between East and West. The Soviet Union saw Britain's support for Nigeria and decided to join the opposite side. Right. They did the opposite. Moscow, desperate to expand influence in Africa, also backed Nigeria. For them, Gowon's government represented stability and a chance to show that communists could work with African progressive leaders. So now we had a bizarre alliance. Britain and the USSR, normally enemies, both arming Nigeria, while France, Israel, and even Portugal quietly backed Biafra. It was a global tangle, and Nigeria was the stage. In July 1967, federal troops launched Operation Unicord, a coordinated assault on Biafra's borders. They expected a quick victory. They were wrong. Biafran forces, though outnumbered and under-equipped, fought fiercely. Ojukwu's army repelled early attacks and even invaded the Midwest, reaching as far as Ore, just 130 kilometers from Lagos. For a brief moment, it looked like Biafra might win, but the world had already chosen sides. As Biafra advanced, Britain tightened its grip. The Wilson government approved massive arms shipments, including fighter jets, armored vehicles, and advisors. Shell BP and other British oil companies helped finance Nigeria's war machine, and British diplomats coordinated an international campaign to isolate Biafra diplomatically. Every time Biafra pleaded for recognition, Britain whispered to its allies, "Don't. It'll cause chaos." Only 4 countries recognized Biafra: Tanzania, Zambia, Ivory Coast, and Gabon. All others looked away. Israel's involvement was complicated. Officially, it supported Nigeria, following its Western allies. But unofficially, many Israelis sympathized with Biafra. The images of starving Biafran children evoked memories of Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. Meanwhile, France escalated its shadow war. De Gaulle personally approved covert arms shipments to Biafra, using Gabon and Ivory Coast as middlemen. French oil companies hoped to replace British control if Biafra survived. For Paris, the war was both political and profitable. Weaken Britain, strengthen France. As bombs fell and villages burned, another war was raging. The war for world opinion. Biafra launched one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in African history. They hired European PR firms, produced documentaries, and flooded the media with haunting photos of starving children. Western audiences were horrified. Celebrities spoke out. Church groups rallied. Money poured in for humanitarian aid. But aid convoys were often blocked or bombed, sometimes by the same countries supplying weapons to Nigeria. The hypocrisy was staggering. By late 1968, Nigeria imposed a total blockade on Biafra. No food, no medicine, no fuel. Britain called it a legitimate military strategy. Biafrans called it genocide. Over 1 million people, mostly children, died from starvation. The world watched it happen on television for the first time in African history. And yet, the UN did nothing, because Britain and the Soviet Union vetoed every attempt at intervention. For them, it wasn't about saving lives. It was about saving influence. By late 1969, Biafra was surrounded, starving and desperate. Its military strength collapsed under the weight of hunger and exhaustion. Ojukwu tried to rally foreign help, but France's support waned and Britain's blockade succeeded. The same nations that once called for peace now prepared for oil contracts. And as the war dragged on, the tragedy deepened. By late 1969, Biafra was little more than a shadow of the country that declared independence 2 years earlier. The population had fallen from over 13 million to less than half that number, most dead, displaced, or clinging to life. Its once busy cities were silent. Airstrips turned into graveyards for relief planes. The proud soldiers who once sang victory songs were now barefoot and starving. But even in its dying days, Biafra refused to surrender. Ojukwu still believed that somehow some foreign power would intervene. France, Israel, maybe even the United States. But those powers had already moved on to the next crisis. Moscow saw the war as a golden opportunity to prove its loyalty to anti-imperialist African nations. It shipped MiG fighter jets, Ilyushin bombers, and heavy artillery. Soviet advisors trained Nigerian pilots and soldiers. Ironically, the same planes bombing Biafran civilians carried red stars, symbols of a workers' revolution, now serving oil interests. For the Soviets, the ideology didn't matter. They wanted influence, and Nigeria's oil wealth and size made it a perfect ally against Western dominance in Africa. Britain never called it a war. They called it an internal Nigerian matter. But in reality, London was deeply involved. British pilots flew missions for the Nigerian Air Force under contract. British engineers maintained tanks and aircraft, and British diplomats lobbied the world to recognize only one Nigeria. Prime Minister Harold Wilson even admitted privately that Britain's support had nothing to do with morality. It was about oil and stability. He said, "We want Nigeria to remain one, and we want Shell BP to remain there." That was the foreign policy in one sentence. By late 1969, France's covert aid dried up. De Gaulle was out of power, replaced by a government less interested in poking Britain. Without France's smuggled arms, Biafra's resistance crumbled. Desperate, Ojukwu sought help from wherever he could, even from apartheid, South Africa, and Portuguese colonies. But by then, no one wanted to risk angering Britain and the Soviets. The Cold War superpowers had effectively agreed Biafra must not exist. On January 9th, 1970, Ojukwu fled Biafra aboard a small plane to Ivory Coast, seeking asylum. 3 days later, his deputy, Philip Effiong, surrendered to the Nigerian government. The war was over. The final death toll? Some say 1 million, others say over 2 million. Most of them civilians, women and children, starved by design. And just like that, the Republic of Biafra disappeared. General Gowon, to his credit, announced a policy of reconciliation. He declared, no victor, no vanquished. He promised forgiveness, reconstruction, and reintegration. And on the surface, peace returned. But beneath it, wounds festered, economic marginalization, mistrust, and grief that still shape Nigeria today. And while Nigeria rebuilt, the world quietly moved on, pretending it had learned something. But Biafra left something behind that no bullet could kill. Its story. It changed how the world saw African wars, not as local tribal conflicts, but as human catastrophes shaped by global politics. It also taught African leaders a dangerous lesson. Foreign powers don't pick sides out of morality. They pick sides out of profit. Decades later, The same oil that fueled the war still drives Nigeria's politics and foreign relations. British and Western companies still dominate the Niger Delta, and the same ethnic tensions, the mistrust, the sense of exclusion, continue to ripple through Nigerian politics. Every now and then, someone whispers Biafra again, not as a declaration, but as a reminder that the war never truly ended in the minds of those who lived it. History books call it the Nigerian Civil War. Survivors call it the Biafran War. But maybe the real name should be what it truly was, the war that foreign powers fought through Nigerians. Because in the end, that's the simplest and darkest truth of all. This has been Not So Simple Africa. If you learned something new, hit subscribe, because the story of Africa isn't simple.